Let me bring in this other part here, which is, as you can see, is part of the forearm. And the reason why I brought this thing up is, as you can see, has already been sanded after I resined it. But notice that because I sliced it in the middle, there is a seam line here. And the reason why I wanted to bring this thing up is because I recommend that you glue these pieces together and use the resin after. The reason being is that as you're spreading resin over the part, guess what? You can put resin in the seam. And when the resin hardens, it's actually going to hide that gap. You don't need to use any other spot putty or anything else. Now, you could if you had some areas where the resin, has not gone in. Let me just see if I can, right there, you can see underneath here, you can probably see a little bit of a gap with a little bit of sanding is going to be taken care of. But this part here is completely smooth. And when you put primer and paint over this, it's going to completely hide the seam. So that's another benefit of using resin, right? Glue your pieces together. And once you have a piece like this, that, is kind of like complete, right? Is the forearm. Then resin the part in sections that I described, but make sure that where the seam was, that the part was glued together. So glue the part. I use epoxy to glue mine. Now you can use different glues out there. I'll leave that as an exercise to you guys. I'm not going to prescribe. I use epoxy, part A, part B, 5-minute epoxy for some of the smaller pieces. Some of the bigger pieces that you need to align a little better, I use 30-minute epoxy to give me a little bit of more time to work. I sand the part, between, just to make sure they're flat. I put together and it creates a very strong bond, I find, for PETG. There's gazillion other things out there that you can use. You can go watch some videos on people doing tests on, which glue is the strongest. I will leave that as an exercise to you, okay? But I glue the pieces together, then I resin them, then, also when you glue them together, if you have a little bit of imperfections here, you can sand the part down, because now the part is a whole part, sand it, put the resin on it, pay attention to actually put resin in any gaps that you might have, and then you're not even going to see the seam. Now, if the gaps are big, right, because maybe your part lifted a little bit off the print bed, because as plastic cools, it shrinks down, don't panic. Again, you can use filler, you can use the spot putty that we talked about to hide the gaps in that seam, sand it smooth, put resin over it, and as you can see here, you're not even going to be able, to see the seam. This is now also obviously the time to also address any sort of imperfections that you might see that they might be obvious, either sand or put a little bit of spot putty down before you can, we'll proceed here to the to the priming phase. But again, notice how smooth this part comes out. I strive for not having any sort of glossy parts after I put the resin. Again, make sure some of these lines here show through, because there are details of the model. If you put, by accident, you put some resin in there, get a file or get a scraper and scrape the line to create, again, that definition, and you will be okay. So just wanted to bring out, let me see if there's anything else here that I want to show you guys. Just wanted to bring out that tip, because again, it's just going to make your work after you're ready for the first priming phase that much easier. Because as you can see here, even though you can see the seam with the naked eye, because again, the resin is clear, if you run your finger over this, there's no seam there. And once you put primer on it, you're not even going to see this seam. You're not going to see it, okay? Because it has been filled with resin, and now it has become one solid long piece, okay? So glue your parts together, sand them, put resin over it, sand the resin, goodbye seams, I guess is the conclusion here that I wanted to show you guys, okay? So with that, hopefully you get to this part. You are now ready to start the painting process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to tell you how I go about it. And you'll see kind of like some of the results that we're going to achieve. Okay, see you soon. And really quickly here, guys, here is another part, big piece here, obviously, is the thigh. As you can see here, this is where I chose to put the seam, because again, it would have made it easier for me to hide. Could I have aligned it maybe a little better? Probably. But again, notice you can see the resin, and notice that I resined over the seam after I glued the pieces together. Notice also that, in a lot of the overhangs where I didn't use support and probably had a little bit of glitch here, you can see the spot putty, right? I used spot putty to correct these areas and fill them in. And, like anything, I just go down with my sander. Notice how when I sand again, you can begin to see flat spots and you can begin to see the glossy parts there. Once all of these things are flat, guess what? The entire piece is flat, and so is going to be the seam. So I'm just going to keep reiterating this just to give you guys an idea of how I went about in sanding this. Again, dust extraction is a must. I love this sander. I really do. It just makes this process a lot easier. Now there's going to be areas here, right? You can see how smooth that comes out. You can begin to see that the seam here is, once we spray, you'll see that this thing is kind of like completely done. And I can get in there with the sander, in a lot of areas. Some of the areas that you're not going to see because there's going to be parts over it. Bear in mind how your model is going to fit together. You don't need to go do any work, right? If this piece here is hidden by another part, I don't need to do anything with it. But also bear in mind that the way this model was put together, there's areas here where we're going to need to glue other pieces together. So in those areas, just leave them raw plastic, right? Just sand it down a little bit because you're going to put glue there, and you want the glue to grip within the layers of the plastic. You don't want to resin over those parts and, not have us a strong connection. So areas where I'm going to get glued, like the bottom here, all I do is I would sand it with maybe 120 sandpaper to even let the glue even grip even more. And believe me, epoxy is going to get between all of those things. The bond between here is going to be stronger than even the layer bond. Okay, so just wanted to just had another video here of me, spending time and sanding down, the thigh. You can begin to see here I did some more spot putty work because at an angle, you can see more layer lines. I use, again, very high layer lines, especially around here, right? On the underhangs, I doubt that I use any supports. But again, notice also that I have, that I use the resin over the spot putty. And this will make it even, even smoother. And again, areas that are going to be hidden by other parts like here, you don't need to do any work. But these areas here where you're going to be, where you're going to see, just make sure you sand those down smoothly. Okay. Just wanted to show this here before we move on to painting to further reinforce, if you will, kind of like the process that I go through and follow to make sure these parts are very smooth. Okay, so here we are in the spray booth. I recommend that you use some sort of a spray booth, but that's not necessary. You can always spray outside. I created a simple spray booth here out of some wood. I have an exhaust fan, and I created an item here out of like PVC to help me just hold some of the pieces together. Just stuck a piece of wood into one of them so I can begin to to spray. So what I do is obviously after we correct any imperfections and we have sanded the part after we put resin on it, I now proceed with the coats of primer. Now, I only use 2 coats of primer. I spray 1 coat. I see whatever imperfections come out because that really first coat of primer is going to show any imperfection that you might have. You can correct those with either additional resin or you can use some spot putty to get into some areas. I let that dry. I then sand with 220. I put a final coat of primer on there, and then we're ready for the final coats. Now, if you did not use resin, okay, then you're probably looking at 3, 4, maybe even 5 coats of primer before all of these layer lines disappear. It all has to do with how well you sand it, how much did you sand, and then again, I go down the resin route because it's really fast. It hides all the layer lines, 1 quick sanding after that, and I only use 2 coats of primer. If you need to use more, not a problem. You can just spray, sand the primer down, see if you see some layer lines, spray some more. Make sure that you leave a lot of time for those coats to dry, and you can proceed there. Get to the point where you feel comfortable and to the point where, your model starts to look good. Now, just gonna scrub here through the video for you guys before we begin to spray. Here is the primer that I use. It's made by Krylon. Is a 2-to-1 primer. I believe that this is it's an automotive primer. I get it. You can get it at Walmart if you're in the States, or you can get it from Amazon. This is about $6 for this primer, and believe me, the model is fairly big here. You're going to use a few cans of this stuff. Now, there's other primers out there. I know some people are using Duplicolor primer, and that thing, comes in at like $21. So 1 can of that to 3 cans of this. Now, I found Duplicolor in some cases dries a little quicker, but I guess my conclusion here is use the primer that has worked for you in the past. I'm sure you've either used some. If you haven't used any, Krylon Automotive for me has worked really well. Because it's water-based primer, you need to let it dry a little longer. So I would recommend an hour or maybe 2 hours between sanding. You might even leave it overnight, right? The good telltale sign that the primer is dry is that once we have 1 coat down and then I sand with 220, if it sort of like sands into a powder in the same way that the resin sanded, then the primer is dry. If it doesn't and it clogs up your sandpaper, then you need to let it dry a little more. Now, and another thing that I want to mention here is some people use wet sanding to sand the primer down. You can absolutely use that. The moisture in the sandpaper, if you wet it down, it's going to keep clogging to a minimum, and it usually makes sanding a lot smoother. For me, I find out not to be necessary. I spray 1 coat of primer after the resin. I look for any imperfections that it brings out. I correct those either with spot putty, or if there's areas that are really, really deep, with filler, I sand those down. I spray another coat of primer, and usually that does it. Now, if that other coat of primer again shows imperfection, I keep correcting them to the point where I feel comfortable and I like what I see, right? So that's kind of like the process that you follow. As we begin to spray here, I'm just going to forward this video a little bit. Thin, light coats of spray, okay? Like sanding, you don't want to stay in any spot too long, because what's that going to do is it's going to cause a run, and you're then going to have to stop, let that dry, and correct the run. So thin, light coats, like you see here, go around. As soon as one area you feel is kind of like complete, move over to the next area. That other area will dry, and then go over it until the entire model is covered. Now, with where the spot putty is in some of these locations, you will probably need a couple of coats before you get proper coverage. But gauge it as you go, right? Just spray. Don't spray. Don't layer on too thick. Just use a light coat. As you can see here, it begins to dry already. In some other areas, it's it looks shiny, which is still wet. But notice also that because of the work that we did, a very light coat, I mean, it hasn't even really covered the spot putty. And look at how smooth this part already is. Where this seam gap is, where I actually cut this model to let it fit on my printer, if I put another coat of primer here, I don't even see the seam line, okay? So the process works, guys, okay? I've tried many processes. Sand the plastic, use the resin, sand again, and you have to do very minimal work once you begin to be ready for painting. Maybe a couple coats of primer, maybe 3, little bit of sanding in between, and believe me, you are going to have a model that you're going to be proud of, okay? So again, just pretty straightforward. I just begin to layer the coats of primer on. I let it dry. This is where, again, some of those imperfections are going to come out, and then you correct them, and then you come back with you know, a final coat after you sand in between. Let me fast forward here. You can see some close-ups here, pretty smooth. Now you can also begin to see underneath here, you can see some layering. Either I didn't resin this, or, you know, spot pot is your friend. Put something over it here, sand it down, and you won't be able to see it. But as you can see, even with that one coat, this thing is pretty smooth, okay? You can't see a seam. You can't see any layer lines. This is really what you want to look for when you start spraying the primer. If you see a little bit of a layer line, let's say somewhere, go back and correct it. Either use some more resin and sand it down, or spray some more primer, sand that down and let it dry, and those layer lines are going to disappear, okay? Again, I probably have not never, but in this model, I don't think I used more than 2 coats of primer. I really took my time sanding it down well. I took my time doing the process with the resin that I showed you. I sprayed 1 coat of primer, light sanding between, a 2nd coat of primer, and I was ready to proceed to the final coats. We're going to talk about the final coats here in a minute. I'll tell you the paint that I use. I'll tell you the paint that I recommend and why I chose it. So, you know, bear with me. That's coming up next. But this is the point where you really begin to see the work that you put into this model. You really begin to see how well, you know, all of these areas here that we paid attention to and used resin, how smooth it comes out. If it doesn't, spend a little bit of time to correct those areas. Let it dry, okay? Before you begin the final coats process, after you think you're done with your primer and you feel it's looking good, I would let it I would let it dry, not die, for at least a day, maybe 2. Again, if you use this 2-to-1 primer that I use is water-based, I find out that if I let it dry for a day, maybe 2, before I put the final coats on, I never had a problem. And you gotta use primer, okay? It really is something that's gonna help the top coats adhere to. Don't even think about doing this without laying down a good coat of primer, because everything just stems from that. It's a foundation for all of the other coats of your paint that are gonna be on top of that. A good foundation builds a really good model, like it builds a really good home, okay? So take your time, get 1 or 2, 3, depending on how much you need, coats of primer. This 2-to-1 from Krylon, you know, I recommend. Let it dry, and then I'll show you guys how I proceed with the final coats and what I do there. Thanks. Okay, so now that you have all of the primer coats finished, and I would recommend you let this thing about a day or so to dry. You know, obviously, if you need any other sanding, go ahead and do that. These are the colors that I basically used to finish the model. The first one is this very nice red, now a candy apple red or automotive red, and they're all from Duplicolor. And now the red here is actually not a red, but it's a tinted clear coat, so that the more coats of this that you put on, the darker the red becomes. But notice here that it says apply over chrome and shiny metal. Now I know you probably cannot get these all over the world. I get them here in the States. These are the colors that I recommend, but I'm sure in other areas you probably find something similar. And since this must be applied over metal, Duplicolor also makes this MetalCast anodized metallic base coat. Now they say about 3 coats to 4 coats of this. I usually, this thing covers extremely well. It's almost impossible to run. And what I found out is I spray 1 coat, I let that dry, 1 light coat. It covers very well. Then I go over it with a little bit of a heavier coat. And that's enough for me to achieve a metallic base coat over the primer, that then I proceed with 3, probably 4, I think 4 light coats of this red. Now the can here says that you have to let this red dry for about 7 days. I actually did that. You probably can let it dry less, 2 or 3 days. And then I follow by 1 light coat of the 1K clear. And then I follow by a heavier coat of the 1K clear, the model becomes very shiny at that point. You don't need to sand any further. It even says he has, UV protection as well as scratch resistant. I find that's done. Now for the gold parts and the chrome parts, I also use these two here. This is just over the primer, but bear in mind that if you attempt to cover chrome with any sort of clear, it's going to ruin the chrome. So I recommend that you test on some test pieces to see how these two come out. I basically sprayed the gold and I sprayed the chrome here, and I did not use any clear over these for the gold and chrome parts. Now the reason why I have this MetalCast sort of yellow here, I wish I would have tried that. I didn't, but I'm giving it to you as an option because this is, even though it might not be close to gold, I wish I would have tried to see how this would come out for some of the gold pieces. I think it might have been a little bit too yellow, but I wish I tried it because I believe that, I wish Duplicolor made a MetalCast in gold, but they don't. This is a closer one that I found, which you might want to try to see how that comes out. But, I stuck with this gold here. Am I 100% happy with the color, with the gold? It's not really chrome shiny gold, but, taking a look at the model and the way it came out, I'm pretty happy with the, with the gold that I used. So that's a little bit on the paints that I used that pretty much follow the instructions that came with the can. And you'll see here in some of the videos that I made on how some of these colors lay down, what they look like, and the process that I used to, the process that I followed to basically finish painting the model before final glue up. Okay, so here we're going to talk a little bit about some of the process that I see in painting. There really isn't much to this, right? It's just a matter of now that you have the model done with all the coats of your primer, and it's looking pretty good. I start with the base coat here, and I spray one light coat, and you can see here on the thigh that I put together, I have one coat of this base coat here, and you can begin to see that it's actually looking pretty good in terms of being that shiny metal that then the red it's going to be on top. So what I do, and I have some close up shots here for you guys in a minute. What I do is I spray one light coat. You can see this thing covers extremely well. I let that dry. I think you got to let it dry between 10 to 15 minutes between coats. And then I spray one heavier coat, looking also for some spots that that I might have missed. That lay down. You shake the can, and I basically, let me just grab the video here for you guys. I just go through and I spray the paint. Again, this sprays extremely well. It covers extremely well. I find it very hard for this thing to run, although again, you can't stay in one spot for too long because it will run. And if it does, no worries. You just let it dry, and then you sand it down, and then you spray over it again, and the run will disappear. But it goes on. This paint is extremely well here. Let me just zoom here, guys. As you can begin to see, I mean, there's so much gloss already, as you can see here from the reflection. And if you zoom in on the surface with the work that we did with the with the resin and also the primer, it is just, it's looking exactly like metal. You cannot see a single layer line anywhere. It just came out extremely well, as you can see here as I zoom. Now, some of these areas in here that you really are not going to see, you don't have to pay much attention to. But if you do see anything, again, you can use some light sandpaper. You can use a 400 or 600 sandpaper to take down the imperfection if you have any. Always, you can use spot putty, and this paint covers really well. So it has no problem covering over spot putty or covering over any sort of primer or anything that you might want to do here. So again, just fast forwarding some of this video here, giving you guys a little bit more of a close up as to how this paint this paint looks. And, after this paint, it dries relatively quickly. So if you wait for about 10-15 minutes, again, follow the directions on the can, you can then start on, layering down the red color. Again, that color is tinted lacquer. That will just go over this, the 4 light coats, and you'll get the, you'll get the effect that you want. Now, the other thing I'm going to mention here really quickly, if you guys do this, always you can use some sort of compressed air to make sure that there's no dust on the model. You can also use a tack cloth to wipe away some of the dust. But if it just so happens that, while you're spraying, there's a dust someplace, a little particle or something gets caught in the paint that you don't like, let it dry, and then with very light sandpaper, 400 or 600, lightly sand that, the dust particle will come off, and then you can just paint over it and you will not even see any sort of imperfections. So again, you can always deal with imperfections as you go through this, because the primer is going to reveal imperfections. This paint, because it goes on so well and it's metallic, it might also reveal some imperfections. But again, don't panic. You can easily solve them by either light sanding or using a tack cloth for dust, etc., and then paint over it. Okay, let me see if I can give you guys some other close-ups of the leg where I think I fixed a couple of those imperfections, and you'll see some of those sanding marks here. Let me bring that up next here. And here I wanted to show you one of those fixes. As you can see here, after I put one coat of this MetalCast on it, actually also here, as you can see, I have masked this area because this area was painted gold, and after I painted it, I masked over it. But you can see here I had either some dust or I forgot what it was, but as you can see here, there's some scratches that I used, I believe 400 sandpaper to get rid, of this imperfection. And as I proceed here, let me just scrub the video for you guys, just paint over it again with another coat. As you can see here, as I spray, I look for that, glossy line to let me know that that part was covered. But you can see here one shot across, as you can see from this spray can, and all that just completely disappears, and it becomes very clear. Let me just see here. You can see it a little better here, and I'm just trying to pause the video here for you guys. I know the camera is focusing in on my hand and not that part, but right there you can see it, a little better as to how it covers everything up. And then as we go to the end, as you can see here, try to zoom in, get a clearer shot. You can see how all that comes out. There isn't any sort of layer lines. It basically looks just like, raw metal. And this is really the area and also the type of surface finish that you really have to get to when you start then laying down the the red on top of this. It takes a little time. It's easy to fix a lot of imperfections. Again, this paint makes it extremely easy to fix those things because, again, because of the way it covers and because of how well it lays down. I'm so happy, with the Duplicolor colors. I know, again, that you can get them in a lot of parts of the world, but maybe there's something similar. Maybe you can just, have them shipped. It's really, really worth it to be able to get to this point for the work that you've done and see how well, painted this part comes out. And once you start laying the red on top of this, it's a game changer. It just looks so great. And I'll show you guys some shots, I think, of the torso and some of the things that we did there in laying down the red paint so that you can see, how that comes out. And here's a couple of more shots of the leg in finishing up my 4 light coats of the MetalCast red. You can see it's already pretty shiny, and after this dries and we also add the 1K clear, it will become more shinier than that. Now, bear in mind that when you do add clear, the clear is actually going to make the undercoat appear a little lighter. Again, you might want to do some tests on a test piece to see, how dark you want this red. The more layers that you apply to the red, the darker it will become. Because again, this is a tinted lacquer. It's not a solid red color. It is meant to show through the metal coat that we put underneath it, and that is really what gives it that very deep color. So if I fast forward here a little bit, guys, I also have a couple of clips here for the torso. I shot this thing in vertically so we can get more details. A couple of things that you can highlight here. Here it is, me basically finishing up the primer coats. I think I used about 3 coats on this one because I had some layer lines that I wanted to hide. Again, bear in mind what you want to show in this model. Obviously, the front here, the chest, the lower torso. This is really, it's going to be what you want to showcase in the model. So my suggestion is, pay attention, make the front here as flawless as possible. It's never going to be perfect, but it will be great. The other thing that I want to highlight is, in these areas here and in some of the, the seams, it's kind of like hard to get sandpaper in there and sand everything. But what I plan on doing is, and you will see in the finished model, is that I'm going to paint black these areas because I want to highlight the seams. It's really what's going to make the whole thing pop. So if you paint these black and you have a little bit of a imperfection underneath, the black is going to completely hide that. So bear that in mind. It's still going to look great even for minor imperfections. It's never going to be 100% perfect, but again, it all depends on the time that you spend in it. On the right here, you can see I have already began to layer the MetalCast undercolor, if you will, before we put the red on. But you can also see here that I placed some magnets into the arm. Reason for that is, I also want to be able to transport the model, and I wanted to make the arms removable in case I ever needed to move it. Now, again, I'll highlight some of those things in the finished product here. The torso basically detaches from the pelvis. The 2 arms also get detached, and also the head. So if ever this thing needed to be transported, it becomes a lot easier to be transported versus you gluing everything in place. I found out that about 5 of these magnets, really strong neodymiums, I created a little plastic notch here that you don't even see, kind of like locks the arm into place, and I'll show the video of that. So, you can see here that it's really becoming to look really good as soon as you put the metal undercoat on. This is also the time that you can address some imperfections as you see them. Now, again, the areas that are going to be hidden, you really don't need to pay much attention to, right? There's going to be a piece here. I really couldn't care less about the seam line because that's going to get hidden, right? So pay attention to the areas that are going to show, and that's where you need to strive for, for perfection. And as you can see here, it's coming out pretty damn nice. There is no visibility of layer lines whatsoever. And once you get to this stage and you begin to see how well the paint lays down on the model with the work that you did, this is where you really are going to get even more into it, because you want to see the finished product. But again, take your time, thin light coats, and let enough time of drying between. Follow the directions on the paint can to give you an idea. And here are some more shots. You can see here I'm using a tack cloth before I start spraying down to wipe the model, down to make sure that there's no dust, before I begin spraying. Again, if you see some dust and it gets stuck in there while you're spraying, no big deal. Just stop what you're doing, let the paint dry for half an hour or so, get a little bit of 400 sandpaper, take the dust particle out, spray over it, and you're never going to see it. And I had some more close-up shots here as I begin to start layering the tinted color coats. This last here, this thing in the right, as you can see, is really glossy because here's where I'm layering down the 1K clear. Again, I strive to lay down a one kind of like tack thin coat of clear, and then I follow it by a pretty heavy coat. Having lighting is very important because you can see kind of like the line where the paint lays down and how glossy it is, so that then you can move over into the next section. You might notice this model, I'm rotating it. I just used a cheap bearing that I was able to get at one of the home stores, and I just placed the model on top, so it allows me to kind of like spin it as I paint, and I have a light that shines on it that allows me to see the wet line, if you will. As you're spraying, the paint is going to go down. Strive for about 40% overlap, so you can see exactly where the paint lays down and where you need to maybe put a little more. Just scrubbing here, showing you guys different angles. You can see the back here was masked because this part here, and this part here is all gold, but you can begin to see how well I paid attention into hiding pretty much a lot of the layer lines. This is where I used extra care. You can see a little bit of a seam here. It's in the back. You can actually hide that better, and I believe I used a little bit of sanding, and then I went over it with more paint, and that seam pretty much disappeared after that. But overall, pretty good. The torso, I say, will probably be the hardest part, because once you glue it all together, and you can see some of the seams lines here where the arm is going to go, how I kind of like chopped it up, right? This was a piece, this was a piece, and this was another piece. This part is really going to be one where you need to pay a lot of attention to, and it will probably take longer than the other parts, just because of the size of it, just because of the way that you need to manipulate it in order for it to get painted. But like all the others, take your time. Thin light coats, I keep stating that over and over, let it dry. And then after this part, we are pretty much ready to, I let this thing dry, I think, for 4 days before I said, hey, it looks pretty good. And then I began to, consider, doing a final glue up, which is basically just gluing the pieces here, putting the arms in. I'll show you guys a little video how the arms get attached. But, at this point, you probably pretty much have come to the point where you have all of your parts painted, and you're kind of like waiting for the clear to dry. I waited for about 3 days for my clear to dry before I begin to touch it, because I didn't want to leave any fingerprints or anything on it. It's 1K clear. In fact, what you could do after this to make it even shinier, you can use some carnauba wax or wax that you use for your car, and you can polish it even further. That's really going to make, this whole thing stand out. Okay. So I just wanted to briefly show you guys some of this stuff and some of the process on how, the paint went down. And after this, I'll have a video where we see the finished product. I'll talk a little bit about how I detach the arms. I'll talk a little bit about the electronics. And, we are going to call this one done. So, all right, more to come. And here's a picture of all the spray paints that I used. And there's probably a few more cans that I didn't save. But as you can see, you go quite through a lot of cans of the MetalCast because you spray on average 4 coats for all the parts. I think I went about 3 or 4 cans of the clear. I sprayed 1 light coat and then 1 heavy coat. A lot more cans for the primer that you see. I think total I was out about 7 or 8 cans of the primer, but again, this is a pretty cheap primer. And then the base coat for the MetalCast, I found out that has exceptional coverage, and I think I used only about 4 cans of that. But that's a little bit on the amount of paint that you might need. It's always good to have enough on stock, so that when you need to do something, you don't have to wait for more cans to ship.